Philosophers in space.
Welcome back to Philosophers in Space. This is very exciting. For my first episode without the
cards.
I was going to say baggage, but that would be too mean. I think I'm not going to go there. No, I love Thomas. Thomas is great, but I'm the captain now. Look at me.
I'm glad this is going nowhere near your head. It's great.
So I'm super excited to be the new co-host of the show. I have super enjoyed all of the times that I've been on the show as a guest, and without going into a ton of detail over a long time, like my life has just been a lot lately. Been going through a lot of things, going through a divorce, rearranging my life, all kinds of other stuff. But I guess it makes sense for me to like give a little bit of the bio and background. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
So far we've got single captain transferred to station with single dependent, pretty much straightforward character development. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds about right. So I have been making podcasts for, almost 10 years, I think. It's been a very long time. Mm-hmm. The very quick version of the story is I came out as trans, got involved in my local queer community, and found it to be like super oppressively Christian. In a way that I like really truly did not expect, and was really surprised and kind of hurt by in some ways, because I had some like really weird conversations with people. And then I started getting involved in the atheist movement and realized that there weren't really a lot of trans voices, or let alone queer voices. And it's not that those folks weren't there. It's just that, like, you know, the powers that be weren't giving many of those folks a platform, I think is probably the better way to say it. And so that led me to start a podcast called The Atheist Manifesto, which some folks might remember, that turned into Queersplaining. And I don't know, just the way that my brain works, audio storytelling, audio communication, audio as a medium is just something that like super speaks to me. And podcasting is a thing that's just never gotten old for me, as long as I do it. And I guess the background that brings me here is that I am a lifelong Star Trek nerd. Probably, I'm not going to say too much. So I'm not going to do the guilty pleasures thing.
When was your first hit?
Oh God, probably, I want to say like 8 or 9 years old. Mm-hmm. I know like childhood memories obviously can be fuzzy, but my memory of it is that I saw Star Trek: The Next Generation for the first time during this like late night marathon where they did like a selection of episodes from the first couple of seasons, and then they showed The Best of Both Worlds Part 1 and premiered The Best of Both Worlds Part 2. So there was that like legendary summer in the Star Trek fandom where everybody was like, oh my God, what's going to happen to Captain Picard? And there were, I guess there was like real speculation about whether or not Patrick Stewart was going to actually leave the show. And so even though this was an era where for the most part, protagonists in shows don't actually die, like they might have bad stuff happen to them, but you can count on them being okay, like by the end of the episode or by the end of the two-parter.
With one really depressing exception in that first season, right?
Well, right. But it was definitely not a common thing, but there was like real speculation, if I'm remembering right, that he might actually be leaving the show. And so he might actually die in that episode. And so there was a bunch of suspense that, again, if my memory is correct, I just like circumvented entirely by not becoming super aware of the show until then. Like, I think I had some cultural awareness of Star Trek. Like, I feel like it's hard to grow up in our society without at least like hearing about it in some way.
Right.
But like after that, I was hooked for like all kinds of reasons. Just like the nerdy tech side, the sci-fi stuff super appealed to me. But as I got older, I started to catch on to some of the bigger messages, the morality and all of that stuff. And that really appealed to me. And then
I did sort of almost half expect you to be like, yeah, I started with an episode with Dax in it, and I was like, I hope this doesn't awaken anything in me.
No, the first like gender type experience that I had with Star Trek was the Next Generation episode, The Outcast, which is it's a discourse that's been done to death in the Star Trek fandom, but it really truly did like speak to me because I didn't have
Crack that egg a little bit.
a little bit, yeah. Like I didn't have a super conscious awareness of myself as a queer or trans person when I saw it, but like I watched that episode, and like for context for folks who haven't seen it, basically the Enterprise runs into this society that ostensibly has no gender. Everyone, like there's no biological sex as we understand it. There's no gender identity as we understand it. And not only that, but you dig a little further, and in this society, that's considered like a backwards thing. And they end up getting put through this like horrible sounding 24th century equivalent of conversion therapy if you're found to be a person of the genders, and of course
one of the cis.
Yeah. And of course one of our alien friends ends up becoming one of those people, and Riker has to like fight for her and that kind of stuff. And my sense of it as a
Riker would
kid,
fight for gender for sure.
well, he was fighting for her. He was ready to throw down.
We'll have to do that episode. That'd be a good one for us, actually.
Oh yeah. Because it's a really funny example because it was really meant to be like a gay allegory, and it stumbled very awkwardly into being a decent trans allegory. Not perfect,
like you do.
But yeah, as one does. But I think when I saw it, it was more like, okay, I have this vague sense of a way that I'm different, and I see how this person is different, and I feel like there's just like something familiar in that. And of course, this is around the time in your life where you start to like really recognize that there are lots of ways that society at large punishes you if you're like too different. And it was really, really comforting to me to be able to imagine a world where that was like, okay. So like all of the people that I look up to on the Enterprise, they're like, Riker especially, he's ready to just like risk everything because he wants to defend this person who's being hurt because she is different from the rest of the people in her society. And I think that was, and that's something that like really cemented Star Trek for me as like my place. And I was a very lonely Star Trek fan for a very long time. I didn't have basically the closest thing that I had, sad face, was a close friend who was really into Star Wars. And that's like the ultimate consolation prize for a Trek fan, I feel like, and vice versa, right? You're just like, it's like an uncanny valley almost, you know? Yeah, and we used to argue all the time. And even then, as a kid, I knew I was like, okay, like Star Trek is my main thing, but like Star Wars is cool, and I think it's cool that people like Star Wars, but I would still have those like fun fandom arguments that you can have where it's like no, like I don't really think less of you because you like Star Wars, but it's fun to mess with each other, right?
Yeah, well, and the example there I feel like really is a great tease for what we're talking about today, which is kind of one of the core ethoses of Star Trek, which is this humanist ideal. And I think what you were tapping into there was that kind of vibe.
Yeah, and I think that's why I love Lower Decks so much.
Yeah.
So,
before we pivot though, right? I know we're segueing here, but we should, we're welcoming you to the show, which is great. I'm super excited about that. And along with that, we are making various tweaks to the show. We have altered the artwork, updated it, got a nice Lower Deck vibe, thanks to our wonderful local bot Ross, Neil Horan, who did a great job on those.
So good.
Check those out.
So good.
You got full trilled. It looks so good. So we have
and
that.
Wedge got full horror, dog body horror, I guess. Yeah.
Yep. Him and Volt now are our little Cronenberg baby together, which is great. We will love them like they are our own. And then we're also going to update some of the Patreon stuff. So we are going to revamp what's going on with Patreon. We're going to have some new patron goals, and our sense generally is that like people support the show because they want to support the show, not because they want new things. So to some extent, a lot of this is going to be trying to implement stuff that we've been wanting to do for a while just because we want to do it. And with you here, I think this is going to be really great. So we're looking at things like video, right? Getting some stuff up on
Yeah.
YouTube. Looking
And
at
if
a
you're
little bit
cool
of maybe-
enough to be in the Philosophers in Space Facebook group or on social media, by now you probably know that we're trying video because we're actually recording video now.
right, a little bit
And
of
very excited about that.
Yeah, no, I think that'll be fun. I have to get used to, of course, being on video because I'm used to just hiding in my little cave. So we'll get that sorted. But other than that, we're also looking at trying to do a little bit of merch maybe at some point. Maybe hanging out at some conventions and maybe doing a live show or something like that, perhaps. But also we want to do a survey because we want to find out, we want to learn a little bit about y'all for starters and like who's listening to the show and what you're into at this point and what would interest you to have a little bit of more of. So all those kinds of things, look for that coming in the future. And yeah, I'm super stoked. I think we're going to have lots of fun as the intro sket I think conveys, hopefully.
Yeah. And so check the show notes of the episode to get a link to that survey. And I'll just say, like, what a lot of people who make podcasts will put out a survey and be like, we just want to learn about you. And like what it really is, let's be truthful, is because they want all of the demographic info to send to advertisers. If that was the plan, we would be honest about it. That's really not the thing. No. We really just we want to learn about like who listens to the show, what you're into, what you like, different things that you might want to see, even topics that we might want to talk about or cover. We have things planned pretty far out, but obviously plans can change. And so it's just a genuine want to like get to know folks and get some feedback on what you all think might be cool. We're going to be tweaking around formats and stuff like that. So we want to make sure that we're not like changing stuff that people like and that we're adding stuff that just like makes the experience better. Right. So,
totally.
Yeah, check the show notes for the link to that survey and it will actually help us out in making the show better. So very stoked on that. Thank you, friends.
Yeah. And so now, speaking of the exposition zone and a little bit of lower decks, as our new captain, you are, I believe, in the process of going to workshop some new engage phrases. So,
yeah.
When you are ready, you can sort of try out your first one if you like here.
Yeah, so this is a thing that captains kind of have to do. This is a thing. And, Captain Picard says engage. And, we have Let's Fly, Michael Burnham's. Right. And so I just thought, like, if we're going to do this, I have to have a phrase of my own because Bop It was great. Like, full props
Classic.
to Thomas for that. Yeah, it's great, but it's his thing, right? And so I need my thing. And so I've been really thinking about this, and it might take a couple episodes to get one to stick with, but so I'm just going to throw it out here. All right, you ready for it?
You might call this even a Cali rite of passage, potentially.
Oh my God.
Something about you brings the puns out of me. It's really terrible.
No, it's great. I cannot express to you how fully I support that. So, all right, here we go. Plot me.
I love the commitment. I really...
Well, I mean, you got to say it with
sells
conviction, right? Like if you're going to be a captain and you're going to like inspire your crew to commit horrible atrocities in your name, like you got to make the order with commitment, right? That's how this goes.
Yeah, no, I felt the desire to plot you. I really did. I was with you on
that. Wonderful. Mission accomplished. So this week we are going over the episode Strange Energies, Star Trek Lower Decks. It's the second season opener, and there's just lots of really cool stuff in this. And I'll say at the very top, one of my big like Star Trek hills to die on is that I think Lower Decks is actually much better Star Trek than even a lot of people who like it give it credit for. I've seen a lot of discourse from people who are like, oh, Lower Decks is great, but of course it's not canon. Lower Decks is great. I love it on its own, but it's not like real Star Trek. And that makes me so mad.
For sure.
Because I get it, right? Because it's the funny one. It doesn't take itself too seriously. It's very tropey. It's very self-aware, very obviously made by a Star Trek fan. Like Mike McMahon is a Star Trek fan from way back. He obviously gets Star Trek, But there is a lot that happens in Lower Decks that I don't think enough people recognize. Of course, I don't want to do and no one's talking about it, because some people do get it.
Right.
But at least cool like in my corner of, Trek Twitter, at least, I guess I should be specific. That's where I'm talking about mostly.
Yeah, no, get as thoroughly online and elitist about this as you can.
Yeah,
really
absolutely.
climb up into that ivory tower on this one.
Yeah, and this is the only time that I'll do that. It's very important for me to maintain humility about the things that I need to maintain humility about. But Star Trek is just simply not one.
Before you start spouting off in Klingon or something, right?
Good job. I will say I even ran into this a little bit a couple of times in talking with a bunch of different people at conventions. Just that Lower Decks it's a novelty Star Trek. It's a novelty show. It's not something to take seriously, even if you like it. But this episode in particular, I mean, there's a lot that I could point to across the series, but we'd be here for days. And so we kind of had to pick one. And Strange Energies, I think, is a great mashup of a bunch of things that make Star Trek great. And so I was thinking what we should do is our transporter pitch for the episode.
Yes. Our transport, and I just want to add, I totally agree with you 100%. And I feel like if this is not canon, then that's a problem. Like, this should absolutely be canon 100%. So yeah, we, in the process of, revamping the show, we are going to tighten up the exposition zone a little bit, because it's just gotten a little loosey-goosey. And to do that, we've got a couple of things we're going to introduce here. The first of which is going to be transporter pitch. So the idea here is I would like you to explain this content to me in the time it would take to murder me down to the molecular level, so that the perfect copy of me that takes over will understand the rest of the episode and we'll be good to go.
Perfect. That's great. And I'll just come right out and say it. This muscle of the transporter pitch is one that I'm developing, just like my captain phrase. And so these may get better over time, but what I have is campiness and Trek tropes combined together into a deceptively simple, or a deceptively funny and emotionally mature episode of Star Trek that is better than almost anyone wants to give it credit for.
Solid. It's pretty solid.
It's a very long run-on sentence, which
didn't mention
I guess
God once, interestingly.
well, I feel like that comes under the framework of Trek tropes.
Yes, you're right. You're right. God is certainly a Trek trope.
Yeah.
One of my favorites, in fact. Yeah.
Specifically, humans or human-like aliens being unexpectedly given godlike powers.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, instead of doing the we're going to talk you through the episode of the thing that you hopefully just watched, we're going to instead, and after I introduce the 10 million amazing characters that we love in the show, we're going to add something else new to the exposition zone. Again, workshopping this here, but we're roughly calling this, there are 4 highlights, I think. And the idea is going to be each of us will provide our 2 highlights from the episode and thereby provide some of the plot without dragging that along too much. So yeah, Callie, do you want to start off with your first highlight?
Absolutely. And it actually comes back to this idea of the way that Star Trek treats the idea of God or godliness, or what happens when humans or people who are sentient in the way that we are sentient, humanoid-like aliens. I don't want to be too human-centric.
I love how you're already in the philosopher's got a caveat, more caveats.
Well,
entities with things like us.
Right. Yeah. So a thing that is often treated as a given about Star Trek is that we have reason for near boundless optimism about the future. And we often kind of skip past the idea that it took World War III and hundreds of millions of people dying in a nuclear holocaust to get there. That's a different conversation.
Except for the time travel episodes, but yeah. Mostly.
Well, right, yeah. But I think this thing. So in the episode, Jack Ransom gets hit by a burst of strange energies and starts to develop godlike powers, which is kind of a callback to the TOS episode where No Man Has Gone Before. And he immediately starts like abusing those powers the same way that Gary Mitchell did in the TOS episode. There's also a TNG episode where Q attempts to recruit Riker into the Q continuum, and he very immediately starts giving in to like the temptations of this unlimited power. And of course, he comes around and makes the right decision, or makes the decision that he makes for morality reasons, right? Like he's not ultimately given over to that level of power. But we very often in Trek will see this dynamic play out where humans get what we would think of as godlike powers and immediately start abusing those powers for their own benefit instead of using them for the benefit of everyone. And I think that is a really interesting way that Star Trek maybe doesn't have quite as optimistic a view of the future. And I don't know how deliberate that is. Like, I don't know if that was something that they were definitely thinking about in the writer's room for like Where No Man Has Gone Before, for example. But it seems that like, even though we see this entire society ostensibly built around like we all work for the greater good, when someone is given the power to operate outside that such that they don't need the support of that society anymore, like they immediately are like, nope, never mind, I'm just gonna do whatever I want and take all the power and whatever wealth there is to myself. So that's an interesting thing.
Yeah, and I think it is kind of there's a couple of different philosophies that I would tie it to, like the kind of Hobbesian view of human nature, where we're like, animals that have to be chained by society. It's a very kind of liberal idea about democracy and like diffusion of power and checks and balances. I think, I think it ties into these ideas that we are civilized by society, and otherwise we would be, pure id.
Which, I'm not an anthropologist by any stretch of the imagination, but I just think back to the idea that like what we think of as human nature is often actually referring to the nature of the specific cultural context that we grow up in. And I don't even necessarily mean like, the Midwestern United States or the United States. I mean, the sort of like fundamentally like capitalist worldview of, we have to lock up all of the resources and make people work to access them, and that's how we build an economy, versus the more like collective type societies that like in the long scheme of human history, like that's not actually how humans have naturally arranged their social relationships. And I think it's a propaganda victory. I think that culturally we seem to just like ignore that like vast amount of human history because we've been taught that, the way that we are brought up, the way that we organize society is like not only the correct way, but sort of like the inevitable fundamental endpoint of human society. Like it's a product of human nature instead of one specific cultural idea that was able to amass enough power to just stamp everything else out.
Yeah, and that's a very like 80s, 90s, 2000s liberal kind of mindset about sort of the end of history. And it also, you were talking about human nature. This is, I think, a really, really important, very big topic that is actually lurks in the background of a lot of our political debates around things like criminal justice, and to address the problem of like cultural influence. What you often see are people trying to argue from, evolutionary psychology or from some appeal to ancient history or, prehistory or things like that. And it gets very messy in those. But I recently just listened to 2 books on this actually, that I'll recommend: The Dawn of Everything and Humankind, both of which are like these kind of very broad sweeping books where I can't necessarily attest to like how much they're cherry picking or accuracy, but at least certainly make the argument that you're talking about, which is, we have been lied to about humankind and human nature to sell us on a certain kind of social structure that we don't actually need.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing, specifically knowing that Gene Roddenberry was a pretty I don't want to say devout, avowed communist, right? And so, in theory, he wouldn't look at the world that way. And thus
they might look at Stalin that way, maybe, after, being disillusioned.
Yeah.
Like by seeing the way that like despotism kind of undermined the communist goal. Like you could imagine it like a significant fear of strongman kind of mindset there.
Yeah. Well, and, the other possible explanation, and I don't have any, like behind the scenes knowledge of this, but the other possible explanation I could think of is that whatever amount of that he would want to inject, he had to sort of tamp down to get it past the suits.
Sure.
Because that's the explanation for a lot of Star Trek shortcomings is you hear that there were at least a certain number of people behind the scenes who really wanted to take it to the level we all sort of wish they would, but it was like, this will literally not make it to air if we do that. And so this was the compromise we made, which, I have complicated feelings about that too, but like that's the conversation, and that's the reason that is often given.
Yeah, as opposed to Voyager, where they just compromised from the get-go because the creators were... Anyway, separate conversation. Moving right along. Another highlight, perhaps, speaking of Voyager, one of my first highlight is actually just fan-serving towards the Doc, right? Like, I think there's a long, wonderful, rich tradition of Doctors in the Trekverse, and yet the Doc in Lower Decks is just the best, right? Like combines all of the weird sex of Beverly Crusher with all of the like snark of Baldo. It just like, it's perfect. It's a perfect surly Doctor character. And in this episode, they have so many incredibly funny throwaway lines. A lot of them references to the original series episode, which you actually told me to watch, and I did, and it's awful. It's really, the original series is very, very, very actually bad. It's not a joke bad. It's objectively bad. But this episode, there was a lot of fun stuff that I hadn't caught before that were just like great bits about that, including the end of this episode. But the part I love is the level of not giving an F that like the Doc has with regard to strange energies. I think one of my favorite lines in the episode actually was, let's see, so they're talking about the strange energies, and he's like, it turns people into godlike powers, and the captain says, humanity has a complicated relationship with organized religion, and the Doc's like, well, strange energies doesn't.
Right.
I love it. So blunt.
And right before that, she's scanning with the medical tricorder. I took a load of strange energy straight to the cortex.
Straight to the cortex.
And that's just such a great callback to just Star Trek technobabble in general. Like, because I'm very tired of the phrase saying the quiet part out loud, but if there's ever a point where it like really applies, I feel like it's that, because she might as well have said like, oh, he took a technobabble to the technobabble.
Right.
But like the medical version of it.
Right. And in the original version, it's like, there's a, what do you call it? A probe, right? It's always like a probe with some like stuff on it, and like the probe sprays you with this stuff, and that's whatever happens. It's fine.
And she like in through like when shit goes south, she's got like a tricorder in her hand. It gets turned into an ice cream cone.
Yes.
Or the captain's like, "What's going on?" And Ta'ana's like, he appears to be working on his buys and tries." Just very dry delivery, which is just, I mean, it's brilliant acting and directing to be able to just like deadpan that so well. I love Ta'ana so much. She's so much of what I aspire to be, and a rare mostly non-humanoid alien in Star Trek, which is a great asset of animated Star Trek.
For sure. Yep. Absolutely. All right. What's your next one?
So I was thinking a lot about basically every other story in this episode. Trek often has an A plot and a B plot, sometimes a C plot. And
it's usually very C minus, yeah.
Right. And one of the things that I respect so much about Lower Decks on like a technical TV show making level is they very often pull off several story threads that feel very much addressed by the end of the episode somehow in like 25 minutes. And so you have the storyline of them dealing with Jack Ransom turning into this god figure and like trying to destroy the Cerritos and trying to figure out how to stop him and all of that. but all of the other subplots have to do with these characters' relationships to each other. And that's part of the reason why I have such a soapbox about Lower Decks being a very real manifestation of Star Trek's kind of highest aspiration in some ways, because at the beginning of this show, basically you have characters who are like sort of acting out these pretenses. So you have Mariner, who is trying to pretend to be like best buds with her mom. And you have Tendi, who is trying to like science her way into figuring out whatever's wrong with Rutherford instead of just talking to him about her feelings. And it plays out in these really ridiculous and funny ways, but at the core, what you have are characters who are dealing with trauma or anxiety about something, and the problems all come from the fact that they can't just like sit down and talk to each other in a very honest way. And what ends up solving those problems in all cases is them finally deciding to come clean and just be honest and have a real conversation about the way that they're feeling about things. And so for Tendi, she's worried about losing Rutherford as her friend. Like, she just is so terrified of losing Rutherford as a friend that she's going to all of these ridiculous lengths, trying to shoot him with medical venom, trying to extract his brain, that kind of stuff, because he likes pears, and because he is like going out on a second date with this girl that didn't work out the first time for very dorky reasons. And, at the end of season 1, Mariner and Freeman are both it feels kind of like a wholesome moment when they get to the end. But at the beginning, it's like, oh, this is miserable. Actually, this is terrible, because like this dynamic is not who we are. Like we're just putting on an act of a different kind to try to get along, and nothing's going to work until we drop that. And in particular, you see this very funny scene of Mariner and Freeman basically doing like a therapy session while they're like running from Jack Ransom and trying to figure out what to do.
Yes.
When you say that, what I
language.
Hear is that you don't like being disagreed with,
and
which is very funny.
Jack Ransom is like, y'all hate each other. Stop it. It's annoying.
Right. And it's, the first time I watched it, I was like, oh my God, they're doing therapy. That's brilliant. And I laughed and it was very funny, but I've seen the episode probably half a dozen times or more since then. And like when the funny wears off, like it still makes me smile a little bit, but I think about it and it's like, the presentation is very comical and not exactly serious, but you really do have like characters with a history who are trying to work out their differences and their like anxieties and traumas with each other. And it's actually like really touching. And, and I feel the same way about Tendi and Rutherford. Specifically I have friends who read Tendi very much as asexual, and I'll say I do too. I'm not ace, so I don't have like authority to like make that call, but that's just the way that she reads to me. And so it's also interesting that her fear is not about having a romantic relationship with Rutherford. Is like she is that desperate to hold on to their friendship because their friendship means so much to her. And it's not about sex and it's not about romance. It's just about friendship. And I think that's so cool and such a deep, like it again, so much deeper than a lot of people want to give it credit for.
Yeah, there's some really tight metaphors in here. I like at the beginning, speaking of like torture and truth, you see like the main character is like, in order to talk about how frustrated she is with her mother, she has to do like a simulation where she's being tortured, like a Four Lights reference, no less.
Yep.
Where she's being tortured.
I gotta get out of here. They keep showing me lights.
And she does a whole escape thing while she's like trying to process through her feelings. I just love the idea of like, you have to literally be tortured to be willing to like express your feelings, as a metaphor for how locked up people can get. I also want to give a little pushback here. I do love the like, this is about talking through things, and that's very humanist, but I also love a little bit about the way that this episode inverts that trope, because the solution here is actually not to talk about it, it's to kick somebody in the nuts.
Oh,
Like,
yeah, well, I mean,
violence is the solution.
The subplots.
Right,
for sure.
right.
Violence is definitely the solution for the main story.
This is a great show where they tie all the plots together, and it's like the main show, they try the talking approach, or they try the positive reinforcement, and it doesn't work.
Captain Freeman goes out of her way, like, you're so handsome and you're good at guitar, and he starts to feel feelings a little bit, and so it's the classic thing where it's like, I'm gonna try a solution and it's gonna look like it's working for just a quick second before it all turns around again.
Yep, it's great. It's good stuff. All right, so last highlight, I guess, then I have down, and it's related to the one you're talking about with Tendi and Rutherford. So Rutherford is this androidish, or not android, I guess, a cyborg.
He's
cyborg
a cyborg.
Character, right? Yeah, excuse me. Get the percentage of man to machine correct there.
Right, exactly.
Right. So he is a cyborg, and he's having potentially cyborg issues, Tendi thinks, but it's a really great piece about, like, true self, quote unquote, right? We have this idea that, like, there's a true self, and then there's someone, when they're not acting, they're acting out of character in some way. And so Tendi keeps claiming that Rutherford's acting out of character, and the evidence that she keeps giving is, things that he's changed about himself, but, like, we all change over time. So it's like, how do you, it's kind of a ship of Theseus almost a little bit, where you're like, what is the true thing that is sticking around? Now, she ends up being right, but I also think it's a really interesting sort of ethical question, the part especially where she's literally torturing him with shocks, and there's a great hilarious bit where he's like, could you at least warn me? And she's like, no, it won't work if I warn you, it has to be random,
right?
And that little shtick, in the span of maybe 10 seconds, they reference, like, the Milgram experiments, they reference Skinner's behaviorism, and they reference the Voight-Kampff test from Blade Runner as well. So it's just like a bunch of really interesting references to, psychological research about humanity, about, like, what makes someone who they truly are and their values and all those kinds of things. And it's just like the like references per second. I'm someone who loves my memes as dense as I can get them. And I just feel like some of the scenes in, like, in Lower Decks are just like neutrino stars of just references on top of each other.
Well, and what I appreciate as a fan so much is that I will admit that I am a sucker for fan service, but I do, like, roll my eyes a little bit when it feels like that's all that's happening. And I feel like Lower Decks has mastered the art of fan service that still makes sense in service of the plot and, like, the broader arc, and in giving you insights into, like, who these characters are as people. And I think the subtext at play here is that Rutherford has lost basically all of his memories after the last episode of season 1. And so this is, episode 1 of season 2. And so, they don't make it super clear if Rutherford's just lost, like, everything about, like, who he is and his past, but he definitely forgets about Tendi and their friendship. Which is just the super wholesome moment of the end of season 1, where it looks like it's going to be a really sad moment. And Tendi's like, oh my God, that means we get to become best friends all over again.
Right.
Which is assuming that he is, in fact, the same person, even though he doesn't have all of his memories.
And then it is an interesting situation where the idea seems to be that, like, a personality persists, and you can have certain, like, personality character trait dispositions and things like that, even if those memories go away, which, you have people with amnesia, and that sometimes is the case. So yeah, it's good stuff.
Well, and if, I can speak to this as a person who has anxiety that gets pretty severe sometimes. She's, like, latching on to these things that, like, you could argue are meaningful. You could also argue that they're superficial, because, he goes on a date with Barnes again, even though their date the first time around didn't work out. And she's like, oh, so that's weird. And then he likes pears. Before, he hated pears. Now he likes pears. That's weird. And one of the things about my anxiety specifically is that I pay very close attention to people's behavior, like the way that they talk, the way that they act. And when I start to see people acting substantially differently, like, that's I don't know if I'd call it a red flag, but it's kind of a yellow flag for me, like, something's up here. And I don't think I would ever torture anyone, let alone a friend, in service of addressing that. But I am the kind of person who would see something like that and at least be a little bit freaked out by it. And so in the context of this being like a cartoon with some obviously like fantastical and exaggerated funny elements, like I actually can identify with that. Like, oh, this person's changing. Maybe they're not my friend anymore. And I'm like worried about what that means. And I mean, that's a journey that like I went on when I came out as trans, because there were a couple of friends of mine who in all good faith with nothing malicious in their hearts were like, I don't know what this means for who you are as a person, and if the person that I know as my friend is going to change such that like our friendship feels different. And it was never like the trans community, obviously, like we tend to like roll our eyes at the notion that like our transition is a hardship on the people around us. I tend to be slightly more sympathetic than average for that. But I think that is largely colored by the fact that the people in my life who express those concerns, like very much went out of their way to explain, this is not a you problem. I don't want you to think that, like, I don't want you to be trans. I don't want you to be transitioning or anything like that. I just want to be honest about my worries about like what this might mean for our friendship if things change, if all of these things about you are changing, is it going to change some dynamic about our relationship? And I mean, at the time, my answer was like, I don't actually know, because like I hadn't met very many trans people and gotten to know them enough to know, like, am I going to take hormones and like fundamentally change my personality? Is that even a thing? Which seems like a silly thing now, but like at the beginning when I barely know anyone, like maybe, I don't know. And so that's just it, like it hits home in those ways for me.
Yeah. I also think there's a very dark, like, allegory here to conversion therapy as well, in terms of individuals who are raised in religious situations who like genuinely believe that their true self is straight and that this is some sort of demon or curse or something like that, who are essentially getting shock treatment like Tendy's providing in this kind of way to try to like stay the person that they think they really are, so that they can be in communion with their community. And people who are like supporting them and doing that genuinely are like Tendies, right? They think that they are helping them in this kind of way.
Yeah. Well, that's what my grandma said to me. Well, one of the things my grandma said to me is, I had the coming out talk with her and answered a few questions. And I think she was extremely shocked and wasn't able to like fully articulate like what her thoughts, what her questions or concerns were. And so, given that she is a super hardcore Pentecostal, I felt like the conversation went as well as it possibly could have been, which is to say that it was really not great, but she didn't out and out say like, I'm disowning you as my grandkid. Like, that was the bar for success for that conversation for me. But like when I was cooking dinner later that night after I'd gotten home, she called me and I didn't answer, like, because I was legitimately cooking. Like I was planning on calling her back when I got done eating, but she left me a voicemail and she was like, well, I just think you have this demon in you that's making you feel this way. And I just wonder if you would come to church with me and talk to my pastor, because I think he could help you. And I was just like, I don't even know how to respond to that. And I actually think, I don't remember if it was maybe, it was like less than a year after that I stopped talking to her.
Right. Ugh, I'm sorry. Yeah. I think that like it is challenging. We all change and there's like these complexities to these relationships. And like, that's part of what this episode is about too, right? That like there are people grow and change and their relationships have to grow and change with them.
Sometimes your head grows and change and you try to eat the ship that you're on. Yeah.
Yeah. So is there's a giant head approaching the ship. I love the deadpan of that. It's so perfect.
And the juxtaposition of this emotional conversation between Tendi and Rutherford with the battle going on in the background, and you see like Jack Ransom's head trying to bite the cell and the like noises and stuff. Yeah. But is it time to philosophize?
I suppose it is philosophizing time, shall we?
We shall.
All right. Well, let's, I guess, go ahead and grok it. So, we're going to talk about humanism. And the way I want to talk about this is actually, I posed a question to you to ponder, which is actually a question about a question, which is very philosopher. Yeah. I wanted you to ponder in all of the things that you've seen in Trek. What do you feel like is the most important, like, actual question that a person asks anywhere in Star Trek at any point in time? Like a literal quote.
Well, and I will admit to saying that I didn't come up with a literal quote, but there is a question that in one way or another it gets posed several times throughout Star Trek that I feel like is kind of at the most fundamental core of what Star Trek is, and that is simply the question of what is a person? Like, what does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be conscious? And how do you decide when that threshold is crossed? And that's that's at the core of so many great Star Trek stories in small ways and big ways. Obviously, there's Measure of a Man, TNG, which is probably the most like well-known and most often referred to piece of that question. But I mean, we have in Best of Both Worlds when they're talking about, or not in Best of Both Worlds, but in I, Borg, when they're talking about using Hugh to destroy the Borg collective, there's this question of like, we need to be clear that you are creating a weapon of mass destruction with which to commit genocide. And we are trying to invent a context in which that's okay. And like, I don't know that the episode goes deep enough into asking that question that it's like fully nuanced and laid out in a way that I feel like does really well with it. But that is kind of at the core of the conflict in that episode. There's also in Voyager with Species 8472, there's this, and especially when they get, I hate the notion that like a villain can get defanged, because I think, especially in Star Trek, the idea is for these things to become big moral questions. And so taking a big bad that's just like this monolithic evil and making it more recognizable, I think is a good thing, not a bad thing. And so, Species 8472, they're like undercover posing as humans because they're trying to figure us out, because they don't see us as people the way that they're people, just like we don't them. Right. And that's the journey is coming together on that. I mean, I could rattle off reference after reference after reference.
Go ahead.
But I think that's at the core of like all of the best Star Trek.
Yeah, it's a very meaningful, thoughtful, deeply well-cited, and unfortunately objectively incorrect answer. I was hoping that you would be able to get this correct since you're an expert on the subject. But I guess
so sorry.
That's okay. I can help you out.
Help me out here.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the obviously objectively correct answer, and it, unfortunately is asked by objectively the worst captain in all of Star Trek history, is simply the question, what does God need with the starship?
I knew you were going to go there.
It's just literally the most important question that any human being could ever ask anyone. What does God need with a starship?
Yeah.
It's as simple as it gets.
Fair. I will concede. I will concede on that one.
It came to mind because we wanted to talk about humanism, which is an interesting subject because both of us, I think, spent a lot of time in humanist circles, communities, and things, even though I personally have back and forth feelings about the word humanist itself. But I think as we were discussing Trek and this episode in particular, it sort of dawned on me that we haven't done an episode on humanism, and that like Trek is humanism porn in like the biggest way possible. And so I wanted to talk about that. And then it occurred to me that like the essence of Trek humanism, right, is the question, what does God need with a starship? Which is to say, using critical thinking, right, to challenge authority in a reasonable kind of way, whatever the consequences, right? Like, and not, go about promoting massive injustice, which is what happens if you let God have the starship, I think.
Fair. That's fair. It's also reminiscent I think it's a little bit less on the nose, but it's kind of reminiscent to me of Who Watches the Watchers in TNG, where they end up inadvertently exposing themselves to what we would consider a primitive culture. Proto-Vulcan humanoids is the word that they use. And, the scientist who was observing them and obviously like has a vested interest in like getting his colleagues back off of the planet as like, yeah, just lean into them thinking you're a god so we can get our people back. And Picard's like, no, like we're not going to do that. And that's, I love that scene. I don't love how that scene is often deployed out of context to be like, yeah, you can't be a Star Trek fan if you believe in anything supernatural. If you're not an atheist, you can't be a real Star Trek fan, because they like to like bludgeon people with that quote, which I get. And I mean, it does say something pretty explicit about at least Picard's worldview. Which may or may not be the worldview of like the Federation writ large. I feel like it's probably the majority view, if not the like most widespread. But just the idea that like we're going to solve this problem by like honesty, communication, compassion, and with human or person-centered solutions to this problem. We're not going to lean into the idea of, sure, they think I'm a god, so I'm gonna give them commandments so I can get my people back or whatever. Like there's a higher thing than just this person's life or my individual life.
Yeah, and the reason that like I thought we should do humanism is because, insofar as I think this is a humanist show, and sometimes a little bit I think leans into the like edgelordy almost version of humanism. Oh yeah. In the portrayal of godlike entities in particular, I think there's a theme throughout Star Trek that's like gods are really just very powerful people, usually who are douches, they're usually not good people in this kind of way. And it is very much, I think, a kind of humanist shrinking of a god down to, naturalist sizes, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, off the top of my head, I can only think of one notable exception to that rule in, I forget the name of the episode, but
Fired.
Yeah, I know.
Pack your bags.
Nerd card, hand it in. It's a TNG episode that's, again, has a subplot involving Counselor Troy being mind raped, which is not great.
Sure.
But, they come upon this planet that's been devastated, and there's this old couple that is unexplainably alive, and basically this godlike being who has given up his godlike existence to like settle down and get married to this woman.
Classic.
But of course, as soon as he is deeply wounded, he immediately turns back to those powers and wipes out the entire race of people who committed the atrocity. And so again, like still gets there in that awful things are done by this entity. But I will say that he is better than a lot of portrayals because he at least feels bad about it.
Yeah, and I think, you were mentioning earlier the kind of portrayal of human nature. I think, there's the sort of, they just think that humans are innately evil kind of vibe, but there could also just be another version of this, which is like similar to the ring of Gaiji's thought experiment, which is the like your invisibility ring, your standard, you're no longer going to take consequences for your actions kind of situation. And the idea would just be that like human beings are ethical when they are in the right kind of social communion with others. And if they are removed from that because they are put in this godlike position or something, then they, no longer act potentially ethically. I really liked actually the one good line, I think, from the original version of this show was the gods need compassion above all else, because as the god is kind of as the god character is becoming more godlike, they're losing their compassion. And it reminded me actually a little bit of we talked a while back about Nick Bostrom, who, whatever you think about Nick Bostrom, one thing he puts forward about super intelligent AIs is that they might not be super ethical, that like being more powerful or smarter doesn't necessarily make you better. Like being moral is a whole separate dimension. But we haven't actually defined humanism yet, so I'll spend a little time here on that.
We should probably do that, yeah.
I know, we've been sort of talking around it, but
Give me the opportunity to talk about Star Trek.
I know you start rattling off examples.
Every other part of my brain turns off. I apologize.
It's all right. It's okay. We'll get you focused in here. Humanism is a term that reads to me almost like speciesistic in the way it sounds, but the meaning is what you were describing, which is that it's like human-centered approaches to human problems, improving people's quality of life, general, like if you think about the kind of broadly liberal, progressive kind of mindset, that's sort of essentially humanism. And I wanted to say a little bit about the history of it. A lot of times when you hear people describe the history of humanism, it's always coached in like the Western history of humanism. Mm-hmm. So you get Socrates and the Enlightenment and modernity. Congrats. But, there were a bunch of different humanists. There are actually humanists in India who precede Socrates by several hundred years at least, who arise in the Hindu tradition. But essentially, there's a bunch of different schools of Hinduism, and one of them, and I'm always going to mispronounce any words, but especially Indian words, Kavaka is, I think, how it's pronounced, is basically a humanist atheist tradition within Hinduism. It essentially says there is no gods, there are no independent selves. They do, very similar things to the kind of what the Buddhists end up doing. And you also have folks like Zhuangzi in China who are making very similar humanist arguments about the limits of our knowledge, about our uncertainty, about our own selves, and what we should do as people as a result of those sort of things. And what ties all of this together is this basic principle of empiricism over mysticism and kind of pluralism over dogmatism, right? Having more options, more plurality, more different ways that people can live their lives. And it is fair to say, I think, that this view has really shaped the modern world. This is kind of what we think of when we think, quote unquote, about modernity. So I wanted to talk to some of the principles of humanism a little bit. What are the main tenets? And there's a list of them. They're called the 10 Commitments is one that a lot of people use, and I'll just list them here. It's critical thinking, ethical development, peace and social justice, which might be in conflict sometimes, service and participation, altruism, humility, environmentalism, global awareness, responsibility, and empathy. And I think it's fair to say we could go through that list and you could probably list 10 Star Trek episodes for each of them that embodies that one particular principle of humanism, right?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. For sure. And I will say that, Gene Roddenberry very explicitly defined himself as a humanist, and publicly identified himself that way. And so that's not something that necessarily has to be read into. I think there could be lots and lots of conversation over, to what degree he lived up to those ideals, because the truth is he often did not. But in terms of at least his aspirations or his values as he expressed them, that, at least in theory, is what he was trying to portray in Star Trek. And so that's why you get the science focused sort of problem solving thing that is it's very much like we have to science this out, or we have to therapy this out. And
right.
I think that ends up being all of the best moments of Star Trek, at least for me, are where those kinds of things happen, where people come together to really think through a problem, find an interesting solution to a problem that involves that actually involves not even necessarily compromise, but everybody ending up okay. Learning how to communicate, learning how to balance people's different and sometimes competing needs. I think Star Trek is at its best when it does that sort of thing, and I think very, very much does not get it right all of the time, but I think at its best, it gets it. And also I think some of when Star Trek is at its best is when these ideas are challenged in a very real way.
Right.
Because, throughout TOS and TNG specifically, there are not a lot of times where they meet existential threats to these things, to their to the utopia the ostensible utopia that exists within the Federation and Starfleet, because you're largely dealing with a group of people who have these shared ideals, and anyone else you meet is an outlier who does not have the power to overcome what you have collectively as a group, as the Federation, as Starfleet, even as a Starfleet crew versus the crew of another ship. But DS9, for example, is so much about what happens when you have to deal with the fact that the rest of the galaxy doesn't live that way. And that's, one of the best monologues in all of Star Trek is Captain Sisko. You know what the problem is? The problem is Earth. Out here on the frontier, all these problems haven't been solved yet, and he goes through the whole thing. And it's, the money shot line is, it's easy to be a saint in paradise. And I think that is the parts of TNG that start to feel sometimes a little formulaic and boring, I think kind of lay that out. Like, it's really easy to be a saint in paradise because you're making decisions that, the stakes are as high as your ship. Which is not to say that doesn't matter, but if you lose, that the world that you exist in is not under meaningful threat, really. In the grand scheme of things, 1,000 people dying in the Federation is obviously a tragedy, but it's not going to substantively change the way things work.
Right. That's why I think it is kind of like humanism porn, in the sense that the stakes are kept generally fairly low so that we can play around with our principles. And I do think a lot of times when you see things go badly, it has to do with the relationship between the kind of empathy, compassion side and the critical thinking side, which don't have to actually be in conflict, but sometimes are potentially. Right. And often I think what we see are, critiques of approaches that lean too far in one direction or the other, right? So you have a lot of, critiques of the hyper-rationalist, but also the hyper-emotional, but also they're both needed for a variety of solving of problems over the course of the show. And I think I agree with you that I like it when they challenge the humanism stuff. I think it's good to reinforce it, but it's also good to potentially be critical of it, like the rationalism part, making fun of the way that it is not necessarily the best towards religious individuals, not super respectful in various cases, but also challenging the peace side of peace and social justice. This episode, for example, right? The solution to God is a boulder, right? You have to hit it with a boulder.
You drop a rock on his head.
Yeah, and I think
well, his body, not his head.
Yeah, and humanism, I think, has a difficulty with justified violence. I think that some humanists get squeamish about the kind of idea of whether it's revolutionary violence or whatever it is, that there's this kind of naivete, and you see it in some of the Star Trek captains where it's no, I can just talk my way out of this. And it's just not always the case.
Which is why, hot take, if Captain Picard was in command of Voyager, I don't think they would have made it back from the Delta Quadrant.
Yeah, or if he was in charge of DS9, where does that go? It would go poorly.
Well, I think he might have made it through DS9 because Picard knows how to turn on the all right, we're going to fight and you're going to regret it. Because I'm thinking in particular of the the episode where he's in the Klingon Great Hall and you'll have to fight something they don't teach you in Starfleet. And he's like, you may test that assumption at your convenience. And it's just so coldly, just super badass, right?
Yeah.
So I think when it involves fighting, I think he does fine. I think it's when it involves there are some times where your survival ends up taking precedence over your morality. And I don't know that Picard would make those decisions like Sisko does to bring the Romulans into the Dominion War, for example.
Right. So yeah, go ahead.
No, I was you're good.
Okay. The other thing I just wanted to mention, I know we're getting short on time here, the humanist idea of human nature, right? Since you brought up what is human nature? Does humanism have a specific view? And I would argue that there's actually a bunch of disagreement within humanism about what is human nature. There are definitely, your Hobbesians who you think that humans need to have these kind of rules because otherwise they will act immorally. And like partly they'll think that that's because they're purely evil or just selfish or something like that. But I think there's a pretty substantial strain of humanism that does have this idea that, like, if you take a person and you put them in the wrong kind of circumstances, they might turn into a monster. But in most normal circumstances, they are default good people. They are default altruistic and pro-social and compassionate, and that you have to kind of break them in some way, or, you know, break the circumstances in some way in order to, you know, and like, if you want to say, oh, well, that just proves who they really are in those circumstances, this comes back to the question of like, who's the real person, right? Is it the person that they are in their normal everyday circumstances, or the ones they are in crisis? Some people, I think, love the idea that like the true you is the one that comes out in crisis. But I think sometimes the thing that comes out in crisis is just a really broken version of you.
Oh, for sure. And I think, like, I don't think there's a universal answer to that, because I think, I don't know that this is like a majority thing or even a significant number thing, but you know, for example, I had a friend who was a Marine, and I lived in Jacksonville, North Carolina with him for a little bit and worked at Best Buy. And so like, I just met tons of people who are in the Marine Corps, and I heard people say directly or secondhand that like, they actually thrive in those sorts of like high energy, high stakes things where it's, you know, you're like firing back and forth and there's conflict and the stakes are life and death and that kind of stuff. And they don't know how to cope with like, I'm at home, I'm going to work, I'm coming home, maybe watching football at night, whatever. And like the people who don't actually know how to cope with that side of things and thrive under chaos and stress, you know. And I think we are all so traumatized by the culture we grow up in. I don't even know that at this point it is possible to come up with a meaningful answer to that question. Because so much of so much of the way that we view things is colored by the lens of the culture that we grew up in. And that is just so constant and unending. It's just like, it's the water that is impossible to not swim in.
Yeah, I do agree. I think if I had to like put my money down on the Dabo table here anywhere on like what human nature actually quote unquote is, you know, based on my understanding of evolution and things like that, I would say that we are, you know, slightly lean good in the sense that we are pro-social creatures. We are it seems that we are pretty hardwired for things like fairness. You know, we do have an in-group, out-group bias problem that I think compromises us morally on a variety of fronts, but I think overall we are harm averse and compassionate, because those are adaptive advantages for pro-social creatures. Doesn't mean we can't, you know, be habituated to be the opposite. Absolutely not. But like, I think that is where we cluster as a species in that sense. Yeah,
I agree. And if you look at the periods of time, like what we know about what, you know, culturally we've sort of dismissed as prehistory, which I think is, I mean, I think there's just a whole lot in the fact that we've just dismissed all of the time before what we would recognize as civilization. Like we've just dismissed that as prehistory, as if that's something like less worthy of consideration, less worthy of looking at. I absolutely positively do not mean to idealize these groups of people, but I think it's fair to say that like for the majority of human history, the default has been for humans to get together in social groups and to act in ways that support the communal well-being, at least what you view as your community, your in-group. And that I think that instinct has been with humanity like evolutionarily for so long that I think it's still baked into us now. And that's, I think, at least some of the explanation for I hate that people call it tribalism, because I think there's a whole lot there in xenophobia.
Sure. A lot of
like dismissing
it's an indigenous culture problem for sure.
Yeah.
But
that does seem to be the only near universal human instinct, is the communal instinct, the idea to form social groups that provide like support and affirmation to the members of their community. And I would say if there is a universal or near universal thing about humanity, I think that's probably the only thing that I would feel comfortable saying like, yeah, that's a thing.
That's a good teaser for our next upcoming topic. I will add also one of my favorite books about human nature, The Secret of Our Success, is a really great piece about the what makes humans special, quote unquote. A couple of features that come together that make us lucky enough to bootstrap our way up to getting to do podcasts. But one of them is that we're hyper mimics. We're really, 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 really good at learning by observation of other people's behavior and mimicking that behavior. And that's a form of social learning. And we are really primarily social learning creatures, it seems like, in that way. And I think, for a social learning creature like that, being pro-social is going to be kind of a slight default, even though they also find that, like, if your models are vicious people, you will become vicious. Like, you'll learn that is the right behavior.
Yeah. And it's interesting trying to dig into what seem to be exceptions to that. People who kind of have the deck stacked towards them going that way, but somehow still find their way out of it and turn out to be like advocates of the opposite. And like, what is there in that? What of that can we use to help de-radicalize people, out of, evangelical, oppressive, like evangelical religion of one kind or another, or, in any number of like, I'm going to murder you because you're different and I don't like you kind of places.
Yeah. That's how we talk about luck. But no, I joke we're at the end of the show. I'm not opening that right now. But no, we are way over time, but this has been a lot of fun. I'm really glad to get you introduced to the audience more, and I feel like this has been a good start for some retweaking of things.
Yeah, very glad to have taken the first step in my journey to just making this a Star Trek podcast. Secret, if you're listening, don't tell.
The
don't tell
Trekkening should have been the
the Trekkening. Oh my God, that's it. That's got to be the season 2 subtitle. That's all we
Trek
got
all the time. No, it is not gonna be all Trek all the time. I promise y'all. We will be keeping that classic tentacle flavor too. It is gonna be tentacles and transporters.
Tentacles. Yeah, very excited about that. Yeah, in all seriousness, I love talking about Star Trek, and we've done Trek mostly because it's like my wheelhouse and the thing that I'm gonna get the most like soapboxy and yelly about. But I'm actually really, really interested to dive into a lot of other things, and this was like a very long conversation that I had with Aaron at the beginning. So it was like, conceptually, I'm familiar with a lot of this stuff, but I'm not super well read and educated on philosophy subjects. And so I am genuinely like curious and eager to like dive into and learn about all this stuff and, be traumatized by all of the body horror and all of that fun stuff. Like, I knew what I was getting into. It's fine.
Right. I've got a lot of weirdness to teach you about, certainly. And then also, I think we have a fun idea where we're going to, catch you up on some of the like intro to philosophy stuff that we covered way back when, but like we got lots of, new listeners now. So we're going to do that, via Trek, because luckily Trek has literally every philosophy thing you could ever care about. There's an episode for it, and all of them. So we will translate everything into your language so that the upload is a little bit faster there. But no, in the meantime, we have other content to cover, I suppose.
We do. We're very excited. So do you want to talk about what our next episode is going to be?
Yeah, and we know that we're overdue for a Q&A, but we figured it made sense to get a few episodes with you on so that people can get to know you a little bit and what kind of questions they would like to ask you. So before we do that, we are going to cover the most important star-related thing that isn't Trek, which is Andor, the new Star Wars show that all of your friends are telling you should watch, because you absolutely should be watching it. It is incredibly, it's the most important Star Wars. Like, I'm just going to come right out and just put that marker down right now. It's the best Star Wars and has the best messages, and I'll fight anybody about it. So we're going to do, now I get to rant. We're going to do,
yeah, let's do it. Go for it.
2 episodes on this, probably. I think is the way it was going to work, is we're going to do the first 6 episodes of the season, and we'll talk about, colonial erasure of indigenous cultures and fun things like that. And then we will talk about the second half, and I won't give away what we're going to talk about there, but I promise that you're going to be really, really excited for it. It's an incredible show. Like, get your tissues, buckle up. It's, I will say, I said this to you, right? Like the first episode, you're kind of like, oh, this is kind of like a intriguey, people survive in, the Star Wars universe kind of vibe. And by the end, you're just like, burn it all down.
Right.
So it's gonna be great.
As of now, I'm only 2 episodes in, and I actually am super into it. A lot of complaints like nothing happens, and I don't know. I'm at a point in my life where I appreciate shows where very little happens. As long as like the characters are interesting and there's like a somewhat cool story, like I'm just willing to go on that journey. So I'm pretty excited about it. And so I guess as a bit of we'll just call it hazing. Aaron threatened me into reading the names, and I just super didn't want to. And
this is your job now. This is all the captains do this. It's totally normal. Yeah. Go on.
First, thanks to our strong AI patrons collecting samples for a non-consensual spoken word album. Big Easy Blasphemy, Dude, Corey Ebert, Jesta, That Bastard Neil Polson, Jesse Rabinowitz, and Brenda Goodman, Alex Arnett, and thanks to our Definitely Not a Clone, we scared Thomas away with terrible movies. And selfishly, like, I'm glad you did. I'm kidding.
No. He will be missed, but his new incarnation also, also good decks. Yes, and that spoken word, I think, is a reference to our most recent NASA, which was so much fun, and people should absolutely check that out. Speaking of us nerding out about Trekkie things, it is very, very after darky, naked time, fun times, good stuff.
So good.
Yeah. Speaking of, I guess we should also make our way towards After Dark, or as we would say in this show, maybe we can head over with the girls from Cetacean Ops for a little bit of swim action.
Yeah, this thing's waterproof. I can swim all night.
Thank you all so much for listening, and so excited to have Callie here. And yeah, come join us, come listen to After Dark, come hear the bonus content, come be a part of this ridiculous journey.
And if not, we'll see you next time.
I love my job.